with Kent State that's about fashion and the Belle Epoque, and then we're doing dance. So we've got buddies. Ohio State's helping us that time. So great things coming, and think about it, and here we go. All right, so this actually did start as a book club in presentation. We read Monuments Men in 2009 in the book club. No, 2011. It came out. It was published in 2009, and we did it for book club in 2011. But we've updated it because I know you're all here because you've seen the movie, you're going to see the movie, you're thinking about the movie. All right, how many people have seen the movie? Aha. How many people intend to see the movie? All right. So it is a great Hollywood movie. And The Monuments Men, though, if you haven't read it, is very dense, very thick. It is the nonfiction account of the story of the Monuments Men during World War II. And I just had the pleasure of meeting Robert Etzel and hearing him speak, and it is very moving. He talks about, he's not an art scholar, this is not how he started life, but he said that one day he was a businessman, and he was in Florence with his family, and they were standing on one of the bridges looking out over the landscape of Florence, and he knew enough about history to ask the question, how in the world did all of this survive World War II and the bombings of World War II? And that started him, that kind of touch of curiosity. One of the things we constantly talk about at the museum is stirring your curiosity, piquing your curiosity, and hopefully stimulating your creativity. This man, this single question drove him on this quest to find out the story of the Monuments Men. This is not the absolute first time anyone's tried to research it, but really I think the level of public awareness about the Monuments Men is so much greater now because of this book and now because of the movie. If you're interested in a documentary on this subject, the documentary is larger than just the Monuments Men story. It's the story of the whole World War II period, the Nazi obsession with art, and it takes you from the very beginnings of their obsession all the way through the story of the Monuments Men. There's a documentary called The Rape of Europa. It is streaming on Netflix if you're a Netflix person. If you're not, you can actually buy the disc, and they'll give it to you. And we're going to look at an excerpt of it tonight. There are very few monument men left. I think Mr. Etzel said there's like 17 of them left, 16, 17. They're all between the ages of like 86 and 97. He has met them, he's met their children, he's gotten to know their grandchildren. And so this story is just compelling, and it is a story that makes you feel extraordinarily good about being an American. I mean, when I heard him speak, one of the things he said is the book has been translated into dozens of languages, dozens. And he said, but the cultural response he's most interested in is the Chinese cultural response. The Chinese have a very different cultural take. It's not better or worse, it's just a different cultural take. And they whenever he speaks to an audience that include a lot of Chinese, he's spoken in China about this subject, and they say to him, we don't get why the Americans gave everything back. You don't give it back. It is the spoils of war. And it's true for centuries upon centuries upon centuries of human history. If you have a war, the people who win the war, who are critical in winning the war, keep the stuff. And if the stuff isn't in their country, they take it to their country. They take the stuff. That is, spoils of war is a long human history. And this is the first time in human history that a winning army worked hard to get the stuff back. We're not done with this job. A lot of things are still missing, and that is the leftover work of the 20th century. And museums are taking this on. But I want you to know there was this incredible effort to give things back, and it was led by the Americans. And it's really hard. It's the story in the movie conflates a lot and simplifies. It's a Hollywood movie. You can't tell all of these men's stories and all these women's stories. You have to conflate them into a manageable Hollywood movie. But as Mr. Etzel said, for him, the spirit of what went on with the Monuments Men really was captured in the movie. So You're gonna figure out which characters are which actual people. There, in total, by the years after the war, there were 345 people, men and women, that served from 13 nations that served in this MFAA section of the different armed forces. It was called the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives Unit. They weren't a single unit that served. What they did was and again, 13 countries, these people were dispersed through different army and units so they could be with the army as they moved forward. Many of these people the movie shows you them like going and getting these guys and getting them to join the unit. In point of fact, many of these people did volunteer for this service. Many of these people would not have been drafted. They were older. They would not have ever been in the war. Many of them were frustrated art historians, curators who'd already joined the war to try to help out. In point of fact, it's kind of late in the war before we try to really do very much with this. There was something in the United States called the Roberts Commission, and it was formed right before the initial American invasion of Italy, in which suddenly we all went, oh, yeah, well, there's a lot of important artifacts in Italy. How are we going to manage that? So the Roberts Commission sort of precedes the Monuments Men establishment of them, and it happened in the summer of 43. There is an inherent conflict here for the Army, and even for the American government, and Eisenhower will talk about taking care of things as much as war will allow, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through. The Monuments men and women from these units stayed in Europe working on returning the restitution of objects for as much as 6 years after the war. So this isn't something that ends in 1945. This is something that goes on into the early 1950s. They moved from trying to protect the actual monuments and buildings during the conflict to returning objects after the war. So it's really an extraordinary story. So here's to give you an idea who's who. Now, in the movie, they change everybody's name, which is kind of, I don't know why they did that, but they did. I was going to ask George Clooney, but he didn't answer my phone calls. So George Clooney is based on a man named George Stout. But he's also sort of a blend of another man who was key in the early Monuments Movement sort of days, which was Paul Sachs, who was a very distinguished. Both Sachs and Stout were connected to the Fogg Museum at Harvard. George Stout was actually a very distinguished art conservator. And he and Sachs early on kept advocating and kept arguing that we needed to do something. We needed to organize. We needed to protect objects and protect monuments. At first, no one listened to them. And in point of fact, George Stout isn't actually right there when they found the Monuments Men. He actually gets kind of transferred in a little later. But he is part of 17 men who were at the front lines and moved forward with the Army in that last year of battle. He was actually on the front lines. Many of the Monument Men and women come after the war, at the very end of the war, but he was part of this small corps that were really at the front. But he had already joined the service, though. He was already in the service because he was trying to get over there to help, and he was notorious for driving around in this Volkswagen that had been confiscated from the Germans and running around in this little Volkswagen, grabbing works of art to save them. It is really true that the Army made these guys walk many places. One man, I forgot where he wanted to go, and the commanding officer said, "Fine, go to it. Walk. It's about 50 miles from here. Go. I have no transportation." So they didn't have a lot of big, hefty official support. There were memos written that said, no, we shouldn't be, destroying things as little as possible. And they were validated, but they weren't given a lot of support because a lot of other things are going on because of the war. But he and Sachs are sort of, George Stout and Paul Sachs sort of blend into the character of George Clooney's character. The James Rorimer character, this is the Matt Damon character, James, is based on James Rorimer. James Rorimer was a professor at Harvard. He'd also worked as a curator at the Met. He was a medievalist. They mention that in the movie. He really is a medievalist. He'd been drafted into the Army in 1943. So he's already in the service, and then transfers over to the Monuments Men Division. He was critical in discovering several, at least one or two of the mines, where the Nazis had hidden things. He is the central character that finally, the woman who worked at the Jeu de Paume, whose real name is Rose Valland, he is the person that she finally confides in and gives the notebook. And we'll talk about that notebook in just a minute. This is the character, and you watch the movie, Cate Blanchett's character, who is named Claire Simone in the movie, is actually a woman named Rose Valland. And Rose Valland was a minor clerk at the Jeu de Paume in Paris. She was not a curator. She was not in the upper echelon of the museum. But the director of the National Museums of France, when the war breaks out, is a man named Jacques Joujard. And Jacques Joujard fights this sort of underground war with the German occupation, trying to save things, trying to minimize the impact on the cultural heritage of France. He did identify Rose Valland. She seems kind of mousy, and when you watch the movie, she looks mousy, doesn't she? I mean, she looks like this little librarian thing. Actually, she was a lioness. She was bold. She was brave, and her director knew that. And they have her be one of the people that stays at the Jeu de Paume after the Germans are occupying Paris, and the Nazis turned the Jeu de Paume into sort of a clearinghouse for all of the art they're stealing from private collections, because the Nazis were absolutely obsessed with weird legalese things. I mean, they're killing people by the tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and yet they take the time to do the little nicety of the paperwork, like, well, you're no longer a German citizen. So we are, we've either arrested you or you've been, deported. And since you're no longer a German citizen, your property is now without an owner. So we're taking it. So, I mean, they really went through this, I mean, it sounds macabre that they would take time to do all this paperwork for ownership, but they did that. And so she was in a position at the Jeu de Paume, so every day she would hear them talking about where they were sending stuff. And she would be able to figure out, as she listened, none of them realized she understood German. And she couldn't give herself away, because if she'd let them know that, they would, there's a scene in the movie where the German shows up at her apartment and says, if I search this, you'll probably be executed if I find something, But she literally did, and she couldn't write it down during the day. So she would store it up in her head, and she would go home and write down, the Rothschild collection. They took the Vermeer to this location. They did this. Here's the painting. So she kept these meticulous records, again, at the risk of life and limb. And late in the war, she does meet Rorimer, the Matt Damon character in the movie. And Rorimer, it takes him a long time to win her confidence. So she will confide in him and give him the notebook. And that's the key to so much of the restitution. Eventually, she actually joins the French army after the liberation of Paris. She was in their fine arts division. She wins a lot of, she gets the Legion of Honor, the French Legion of Honor. She gets the Medal of Resistance. She becomes a commander of the Order of Arts. These are all major awards that she wins. But she was never really heralded in her native France the way many of the men were. In case you're interested, if you've seen the movie, there's this little pretend sort of romance sort of moment between Matt Damon and the character of Claire Simone. Maybe that happened between Claire Simone and the Matt Damon character. It did not happen with Rose Valland. In fact, I have to tell you, as a woman, I was a little irritated by that. It was like, suddenly it looks like she wants to go out on a date with him and drink wine, so that's why she gives him the book. She gave him the book because she finally trusted him and thought he was the one that would get the job done. And it was not about romance, but it's a Hollywood movie. We quibble. And after the war, she was a tireless advocate for returning the restitution of works of art. Many people in France just wanted to forget the war, and they wanted to stop talking about the stuff that had been stolen. They wanted to stop. They were tired, and that's natural for people after a war. But she was the one that kept saying, we know we've got to find everything. We've got to find the things that are still missing. Ronald Balfour is the movie character Donald Jeffries. He was a Brit, and he is killed in the war. He was not killed trying to save the Bruges Madonna. He was, again, that's a conflated story. He was killed trying to save another church, an evacuation. It was bombed. Walter Hancock, the John Goodman character, is based on Walter Hancock, who they renamed him Walter Garfield. He was the sculptor. Robert Posey is the historic character on which Richard Campbell was based. He's also a conflation of a few other characters, but mostly Posey. And Posey was is one of the key people who does find the Bruges Madonna. So he's part of that. And then he was a true, and they really did team. Robert Posey was teamed with Lincoln Kirsten during the war, and they went around sort of as a twosome, helping and finding things. Lincoln Kirsten, of course, does anybody know who Lincoln Kirsten is? Lincoln Kirsten founds what? The New York City Ballet. And Lincoln Kirsten was actually very aristocratic. He'd gone to Harvard, and he really it was a real bite for him that he was a private. They made him a private. They almost didn't get him in at all. And they made him be a private. I think it kind of really irked him. But the two of them together did an incredible amount of work. The character of Sam Epstein is based on Harry Ettinger, who was indeed, Ettlinger, excuse me, who was indeed, had been German-born. He was Jewish, of course, and came back with the American Army because he, of course, his family's immigrated, and he was an incredible help. So he's based on a real character. The Frenchman is a complete invention. During the war itself, the last years of the war, there were no French officers working alongside the American monuments men. All right, now Nancy, is this the moment? Nance, are you up there? You guys are up there? We're going to do this clip.
I remember having a very boozy discussion with Stuart Leonard in a Berlin apartment one night. Which is of more value, a work of art or a human life? And I was saying human being, and he was saying work of art. And that's why we had another drink, and then we had another drink. And I said, well, would you give your life to save Chartres Cathedral? And he said, sure. And then he said, and actually I had that choice to make because there were bombs placed around Chartres Cathedral that I, as a bomb disposal expert, we came into Chartres, and I was the one that had to take them and dispose of them. He won his argument that way.
So that was Bernard Taper, who was one of the monuments men, and the other gentleman that he was arguing with and telling the story about was Stuart Leonard. They both lived nice long lives. Stuart Leonard actually is the first director of the Zanesville Art Institute and goes on to be the assistant director at the St. Louis Museum. Mr. Taper was a journalist, taught at Berkeley and then worked for the New Yorker. So this, would you sacrifice your life for a work of art? And the movie gets a little bit preachy, but it is true. One of the things that we need to remember about what was going on, the amount of material is mind-boggling. 16,000 works of art were withdrawn from German museums because they were identified as being by degenerate artists. Degenerate artists were essentially modern artists, and the absolute worst version of modern arts, modern Jewish artists. So those were all withdrawn from the German museums. It took 37 convoys of 8 trucks each to empty the Louvre, to try to save the Louvre. I'll show you some pictures. They evacuate. As the war progresses, museums start making plans of how to take care of the art, how to protect it. The Hermitage also tries, the Hermitage collection, okay, how many people have been to the Louvre? Okay, ready? The Hermitage's collection is 4 times the size of the Louvre. So the Hermitage was faced with really that horrible choice of what do you save and what do you leave behind as they tried to evacuate. There are still over 59,000 works of art missing. In France alone, 22,000 works were taken from 203 collections who were declared ownerless. That was that little legal loophole of the Germans, and they just confiscated the works. More than 6,500 were intended for Hitler's Führer Museum. So the Germans were, from the beginning, incredibly obsessed with the art. They created a unit called the ERR, and it literally was, they made inventory books of the stuff they wanted to steal from public and private collections to create, one of the things they wanted to create was the Führer Museum. There were 39 volumes in this inventory to give you the idea, the scale. And again, people have always looted, but the Nazis loot on an industrial scale. And it's done so methodical. It's done in this kind of just methodical, they're really well organized about this, and that makes it all the more scary. I think the other thing, this just shows you all the Leonardo da Vinci paintings that were in harm's way during World War II. It's kind of mind-boggling. The other thing, so in the Nuremberg trials after the war, some of these were in these inventory books. Let me just listen for just a second. 21,903 works of art, 5,200 paintings, pastels, and watercolors and drawings, 684 miniatures, glass and enamel paintings, illuminated books, and manuscripts, 583 sculptures, terracottas, and medallions, 2,400 articles of furniture of art historical value, 583 textiles, tapestries, embroideries, etc., 5,800 objects of decorative arts, porcelains, bronzes, etc., 1,286 East Asiatic works of art, 259 works of antiquities. That's the scope of what they were trying to steal, to gather in for themselves. And they had identified these, they hired art scholars to work for them to identify these art objects and begin to get them, for themselves. The other thing that it's very important to know is that the Nazis took not just valuable works of art, they took relatively unvaluable works of art, unvaluable objects, material objects, because there were 2 goals here. One goal was to get all the great stuff of the world and take it back to Germany. The second goal was to erase the memory of people. And you think about that. I mean, and the movie does that. The movie does this little preachy moment, but really that's what it's about. The question of whether you would sacrifice your life for an art object is an interesting way to say it, but what these people were, what